is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This episode number 699. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line all the way from Denver, Colorado, fresh off a rainstorm, it sounds like, it's Luis Scott-Vargas. Boy, you've had a week.
Yeah, as it turned out, the kind of like the side of our house, the dirt under the rocks and the gravel wasn't compacted quite enough when they put it in, so it kind of all sunk, which was good because there's like a 2-foot gap under our fence that the dog could have escaped, but we were able to catch that early enough that it was not an issue. But yeah,
Jules
definitely
would have been roaming free.
What it probably would have happened is that we would have seen the from our office, seen the dog walking in our front lawn and be like, what the?
Yeah.
But obviously, there are worse places that could go as well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that sounds pretty annoying, but I'm glad that it wasn't worse than that. And I'm also glad that you're here and ready to go on our podcast. This week, we've got kind of a whole bunch of stuff to talk about. We're going to talk about March of the Machine through the lens of the Pro Tour testing. One of the great things about having Luis as a co-host is that, he's part of a Pro Tour testing team. And that means that you as the listener get an insight into the limited meeting that normally you have to be on that team to get access to. I mean, that's the bottom line, is you have to be a member of one of these big testing teams, and they don't spread this information out until after the PT is over. But it's just as valuable now as it was for them. That's
not entirely true. I actually showed 6 of my opponents what I thought about the format during the PT.
That's true. You did spoil your strategies for them. And let's just say they had a worse time than our listeners will. So we're going to get a recap of the limited meeting from Luis about March of the Machine. We're also going to take this episode. We know a bunch of you had asked, and we had talked about revisiting Phyrexia All Will Be One and Shadows over Innistrad Remastered, the two sets that kind of came out side by side or overlapped with each other a bit there, because they kind of got lost in the fray. We really wanted to get the set review up for March of the Machine as soon as possible, and it kind of meant stepping on those shows. So we're going to take the second part of this show to address those as well. Also, we wanted to mention that Luis and I were at the Pro Tour last week and actually intended on recording a show from the hotel room, but it didn't quite happen.
Yeah, and I want to apologize for not communicating about that. We should have been a little bit more on top of that. Next time that it turns out that we're going to end up having to punt on a show, then we'll certainly let y'all know in a more timely fashion. But the week just kind of caught up to us and or got away from us rather. So yeah, that was unfortunate. But we're back now.
Yeah, and so sometimes it can usually we can carve out some time when we're on the road, but it actually can be quite difficult depending on scheduling and stuff. Because one thing that people don't realize is that, with the PT testing teams, some of the guys will get there early, but sometimes they don't, right? Like you have a really busy life, Luis. You can't just, go away for 3 weeks or whatever and stay in some testing house. And so, you have to show up with kind of just a couple of days to spare. And, that means that it does get to kind of crunch time and sometimes things can kind of get away. At any rate, that's what we're going to be covering on the show this week. But first, we want to thank our supporters via Patreon. It's patreon.com/limited resources. Thank you for supporting us on there. Especially now, we're looking around for sponsorship and stuff, but right now we don't have one. And that means that the Patreon's kind of floating the show, and we really appreciate everybody who supports us there. It does mean a lot. And thanks for that. It's patreon.com/limited resources. If you're interested, one of the things that you do get as a patron of the show is you get access to the Patreon feed, which means that you get to ask questions for the Patreon question of the week. This one comes from Frank, who says, I am an intuitive player, and I've done very well. But I feel like I'm reaching the limits of this play style for me. And if I'm going to win more at a high level, I need to learn to play slow as well. Do either of you work through a similar hole in your game? And if so, what was your process for filling it? This is a great question for you, Luis, because I definitely consider you an intuitive player as well. You've sort of built up the background over the years, put in your 10,000 hours, as it were. And then, once you get a feel for a format, you just do. And then I can ask you, hey, why did you do that? And you can tell me, but you didn't think about it ahead of time. You sort of intuit most of it. But after having covered you at the Pro Tour level for all of these years, You absolutely have that gear that Frank's referring to where you recognize the spots where it's like, I can't just go off the cuff here. Like I really need to like math this out or come to a more firm conclusion before moving forward with the game. So you do actually have kind of both of those things going for you. Was that always the case, or did you have to work through it like Frank's referring to?
Yeah, so I actually somewhat disagree with what Frank's saying, in that Frank's saying like, well, to take my game to the next level, I'm going to have to slow down a bit and figure that out. Well, kind of, but I've found that it doesn't help me that much to slow down too much, because you do that too. Anyone trying to play at a pace that's not their organic pace, I think does cost themselves some. When I try to slow down too much, I actually don't find that I'm playing like my best either. And you have someone same way what happens when someone who normally plays slow tries to play fast. Right. And that doesn't mean you can't slow down a little and think about things a little. And it doesn't mean that it's good to know that you're an intuitive player, because there's some really big strengths and some big weaknesses. I think part of the reason I've been doing better in this draft format, was I played a ton and my intuition was on point. I knew everything that was going on in the format, just A to Z. Phyrexia all is one. I didn't get to that level of mastery, and part of it is I didn't like it as much, and that does matter. Like when it's the end of the day and I'm deciding what I'm going to do with my last hour before I go to bed. If in the last month it was play Mom Draft, because I thought it was really fun and it helped me test for the Pro Tour. Great, win-win. Even before Pro Tour Philadelphia, where Phyrexia was the format, I couldn't really make myself play that in the last hour of the day every time. Sometimes I did, of course, but it wasn't my priority because it wasn't a fun format. So at some point I just kind of was like, well, I'm going to play enough till I feel like I'm pretty prepared. But if my preparation for that PT was like, 80% of the way that I could have gotten there, 85%, I was at like, 101% when it came to March of the Machine. Because I just, that was the format I was just into. And so the best advice I can get is, if you do want to take your game to that next level, if you do want to be, that good and be at a point where you can really just, achieve or give yourself the best chance of achieving the goals you're trying to achieve, you have to put in a lot of time. You have to put in a lot of practice. And that's true for the players who aren't intuitive as well. I mean, it's not like those players even more have to spend that time playing, because otherwise, they build it on reps and trying to logically break down what's going on. But if you're an intuitive player, your intuition has to be trained. And once you get there, you're going to be in pretty good shape. Yes, you do have to watch your pace of play, and you should think about things like, there was definitely games at the Pro Tour where I knew what I wanted to do, but instead of just doing it and firing it off, I thought about it for a second, and then most of the time I still did it. But trying to give yourself that little extra sanity check is valuable. But don't try to slow down your pace of play from an 8 to a 4. You're just going to throw yourself off. And that's what I've experienced when I've tried to do too much of that.
How do you know, though, what if Frank wants to add the ability to do, let's say that right now Frank's just sort of always going off of intuition, but realized after, if I would have thought that through, I would have come to a different conclusion on a particularly complicated board state or a really important turn, where you have to make a decision about which direction am I taking this game? How do you know when to do that? Because I've seen you do it. It's not like every play you make at every game, no matter what, it's just lightning quick. It's just most of them are. But then when the really tough decision, especially like a fork in the road moment for a game comes, I'll see you take a minute to really kind of digest it all, Yeah,
and that's experience is part of it for sure. Practice. I know, I kind of know what things to look for when it comes to when I should slow down or what's an important thing. The stakes of the games matter too. When I'm playing on, Arena on my phone before I go to bed, I'm not thinking about my plays all that much because I just don't really need to. But when I'm playing at the Pro Tour, I'm doing a lot more double checking of myself. I guess part of it is getting the experience to know what the pivotal points in a particular game are, or what the sorts of things that break the pattern. That's a really important thing to identify, because when you're intuitive, a lot of it is you're leaning pretty heavily on heuristics, right? Yeah. So whereas if I wasn't trying to double check or think through things, often I'll just make the play that uses all my mana because it's just right so much of the time. Yeah. It's honestly scary how much of the time it's right. Like you just should be doing that most of the time. That said, if you run into one of those points, and I had one of those points actually in one of the games you covered at the PT when I was playing against the blue-red deck, the deck that had all 4 of the Ral's reinforcements.
Yeah,
I had a game a turn where I played Omen Hawker when I had 2 mana up instead of playing a 2-drop. And the reason I did that was because next turn Omen Hawker was actually going to provide 2 mana. It would be way better than me playing another like 1/1 Death Touch, which is what I would have played otherwise. And I had to just kind of identify that. I had to look at what was going on and think like, oh yeah, this is what what's going on here. So,
by the way, that game was awesome.
Yeah, it was a good game. I think
you played that really well. That was not an intuitive play pattern that you put forward. You saw, hey, if this happened, basically Luis's opponent was playing a little bit of a weird build. It was a red-blue Convoke deck that just missed on Convoke, but had all of the support for it, including 4 Ral's reinforcements and Preemie Champion and this other stuff. I mean, if that deck would have found a bunch of Convoke payoffs, it would have been absolutely bonkers, but he didn't.
Oh, yeah.
And so, but what that meant, though, was that Luis was facing down these incredibly gummed up board states, right, with just a ton of just random 1/1s. And Luis actually didn't have that much raw power to punch through himself. And so it got kind of weird, but you ended up, and I mean, we can put a link if this is up on YouTube. I'm assuming it is. But, you found a sort of a play pattern, right? Even though he was putting pressure on you it was a Fearless Scald, right?
Fearless Scald was attacking in return.
Yeah, yet it felt like somehow every time he attacked with it, he fell behind a little bit. It was very weird.
Yeah, it was a weird game. It was a game where I had to use a Temporal Cleansing to put a Preemie Champion back on top, which obviously that's not always ideal. But then I was able to use Unsealed and Necropolis to then mill it. And once we got to that point, we both had a bunch of creatures on the ground, except I had a Xeric Strobe Knight and I had Phyrexian Butcher, the lord that when it comes to play gives your Phyrexians menace and it gives all your Phyrexians +1/+1. And I was able to like manipulate that using Omen Hawker to bring it back a bunch of times where like the game might have looked like a slog and we weren't doing anything, but I was getting an advantage pretty much every turn that passed by.
Yeah.
And I think that even though my opponent was forcing me to chump every turn, it didn't really help them advance their game plan all that much. And in fact, I think my opponent probably needed to play a little differently to hope to win. The path they went down was not one that I think was going to lead to them winning.
Yeah, and even Paul and I covering it, it was like you could see that start to unfold. But I will say that like at a snapshot, a board state of somebody attack. Did he also have an equipment for the Scald or something?
Yeah, so initially he was using the Mirren splitter, the +2/+0.
The Bane splitter.
On the last turn, he drew the Boomtown Beat Stick, and that actually would have been a problem if it was earlier because it gives menace, and I was at 8, so I had to block it. But he drew it on the turn before he died. Basically, he played it equipped attack. I chumped with 2 things. I double chumped, which is not an ideal situation. But then the turn after that, I just brought back Phyrexian Butcher and just pushed everything. So
yeah. Anyway, great question, Frank, and I appreciate it. I want to let's do our crack a pack, but I want to continue our conversation about the PT. We kind of zeroed in on that one match, but I want to get a broader PT recap from you, and then we'll also do the limited meeting overview to give us that sort of inside track under the testing. But I love it when I get to hear your perspective on a match that I covered, because it's like, I'm making a bunch of assumptions on your behalf, right? And then I get to actually hear if I was right about them or not. All right. I actually have a real booster pack this time.
Nice.
Producer Jeff is he's on vacation, so we're not doing a video of this one. But I got these packs actually at the Pro Tour. It was there in Minneapolis. Okay. So our first card off is Traumatic Revelation, which has actually been okay. I think we gave this a fairly low grade, but it does actually see play.
This is the duress or coercion variant that I've liked the most. I would always play one, and I often play two.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just happy to have this card in my deck.
They finally solved it, right? Like
Yeah.
this gives you the if you brick or if you choose to not take something, it's not just a 0. And they actually went pretty hard. It incubates 3. Like it's not just a 0. It's like actually good, like 2 mana 3/3. Hanger Scrounger. That's the 2 and a red backup one that does the rummaging.
Not a big fan of this. Not a big fan of red. I think you can pretty easily avoid. This ended up just being like low end filler.
Yeah. Disturbing Conversion. That's the flash enchantment that gives creature -X/-0, where X is the number of cards in their yard, and it mills both players for 2 when it ETBs.
Not a card. Not a card I'm a fan of. I find it tends to be pretty ineffective. If you want Stasis Cell or Stasis Field, whatever, the enchantment that makes a creature into a 0/2 and loses its abilities is a lot better. Stripping abilities is a pretty big game. So I find that to be a much more effective way to kind of control something. And also milling them is usually a negative until the point, of course, where it wins you the game.
Right. Overgrown Pest, my boy.
The pest is decent. I don't mind the pest.
I like the pest. Yeah.
I think that it's because of Skittering Surveyor. It's a little bit not in demand. Like you can, you're pretty happy if you end up with some combination of them in the decks that want them. So I think that you're not in too big of a hurry to pick up pests from what I've seen.
Next card's been pretty good. Knight of the New Coalition. That's the 3 and a white 2/2 Vigilance Knight that creates a token that's the same.
Yeah, this one's solid. I mean, if you are in Knights, you definitely want the card. If you're not in Knights, I don't think the card is very good.
Right.
So,
Corrupted Conviction. This is the black instant sack creature. You draw 2 cards, or artifact maybe. No, just creature.
No, just a creature. It's not a card I heavily prioritize either.
Yeah, it's low end.
You'll play it sometimes. I think it's a playable card. It's just not a card I'm really that excited about. And overall, I think that you can get them if you want them. I've never had a deck where I'm like, man, I really wish I had one more Corrupted Conviction. I wasn't able to see it.
No, that's never happened. And the second one's really not good anyway. Realmbreaker's Grasp. That's the 1 and a white aura that enchants an artifact or creature and shuts it down.
Yeah, fine card. Not a first pick. Very far from a first pick because you just don't want to start out in white. Red and white are the 2 weakest colors by, I think, a pretty decent margin. And even in white, it's not like Realmbreaker's Grasp is a super high priority. It's fine. Like you'll put it in your white decks. But
what we've seen recently, these are pacifism variants, is they've gone down in value. Consistently, we've seen ways to bounce, sacrifice, etc. the creature. And the way that I viewed them more and more is OG pacifism, like in a core set. That was just a hard removal spell. I viewed it as a 2 mana way to neutralize a threat, and I was happy with that. I view these ones as more like a tempo play now. Like it will keep something off the board for a little bit. And so if you're able to like play this, attack with a bunch of stuff, maybe play another 2-drop the same turn, like that's where you're really going with it with Realmbreaker's Grasp. But it's closer to, something maybe like a bounce spell, something like that. It tends to outperform those. But, it's closer to that than you'd think, right? Than it is to just like 2 black, Deadly Derision or whatever. These, if you are planning on hanging around and playing a more prolonged mid game or late game, the Realmbreaker's Grasp will expire at some point and become something that becomes a little bit of a liability for you. But if you can capitalize on taking a creature out for just 2 mana and pile on a bunch of damage or flip a battle or something, then I'm much happier to be running it. But I agree. It's a little low on the radar just because it's in white. Phyrexian Archivist. I don't think I've ever seen anybody play that card. Uncommons. All right. Gift of Completion.
A lot worse than Traumatic Revelation.
Yeah, because you kind of get that anyway.
Yeah, I think you'd rather have the option. Getting a Surveil whenever a Phyrexian dies, I just don't think is that high of a priority.
Mm-hmm. Card plays pretty well, though. I've ran it numerous times and been fine with it. Where are you at out of the commons, by the way, before we go any further? Overgrown Pest, Traumatic Revelation, Realmbreaker's Grasp.
I guess I would take Man, I guess I would take Traumatic Revelation over Realmbreaker's Grasp, actually. It's bad, but what are you going to do?
Yeah, I mean, this only the commons, so, it is what it is. Man, next card, I really want your take on this one, because I can't tell if this is the, the card I always lose to, but never win with, or if I'm just underrating it. It's Wicked Slumber. That's the 3 and a blue instant with Convoke, and tap 2 creatures, and you can put stun counter on either of them and another one on either of them.
Yeah, I don't think the card is a card I'd want to take early, but it is good when it's good. Like it is a powerful card, and my teammate Brent Voss, who actually he 6-0'd at the Pro Tour as well. His blue black deck had 2 copies of Hirobi and 2 Wicked Slumbers. It was such a sick deck.
Okay, that's awesome. Yeah, because I mean, I don't think there's ever really been a question about the raw power on Wicked Slumber, right? Like instant speed, like you get to do this before combat on your opponent's turn, and you just take them out of like 2 full turn cycles of action, and it's 2 creatures. Like, I mean, generally speaking, not the type of effect you want to do when you're behind, to try to keep yourself alive, but still that even buys you a lot of time. And if you're putting pressure on, which is where this card really shines, I mean, there's very few cards, even in this set, that can take out 2 creatures for 2 turn cycles and effectively, let you just attack freely. Again, battles maybe make this card a little bit better because, if we try to compare getting in for 4 damage or 5 damage versus flipping a battle and having like a big advantage for when the Wicked Slumber wears off, like that's, a much different scenario. But I think it's one of those classic cards where I just don't prioritize it quite highly enough to get them. And other people do. It's a very flashy.
That's a reason I don't play with it too often either, though. Yeah. It can be pretty sick in the Knights deck. You attack with some Vigilance Knights, and then Wicked Slumber before blocks, tapping some of the Knights or whatever.
Yeah, it's really good for that. Next is Mutagen Connoisseur. This is the 1 blue green 0/5 flying Vigilance. It gets +1/+0 for each transformed permanent you control. I mean, they did a good job of at least pumping the stats on this to make it respectable, but like this whole cares about transform permanence thing just feels like a total afterthought design wise. And I don't think I've ever seen this thing get bigger than like 2 or 3 or something like that.
It's a good card in the blue green deck because you do end up in a spot where it blocks well, gives you time to like get your long game going and all that. But yeah, it doesn't get huge. And I certainly wouldn't take it super early just because you're pigeonholing yourself into a 2-color combination that's not one of the best ones, though it's okay. Yeah. And also, this isn't a splashable card. Like when you first pick, Invasion of Amonkhet's a great card, but even if you don't end up one of the 2 colors, you can often splash it, and it's worth doing so. Mutagen Connoisseur is like, if you're in blue-green, this card's okay.
Yeah. I end up playing it in my multicolor deck sometimes, but that's just because it's a good blocker. Our last common, it is a common. I should have read it before, but it's double face, so it's kind of in a different part. It's Order of the Mirror. That's the 1 and a blue 2/1. You can pay 3 and a Phyrexian white to turn it into the 3/3 that shrinks down blockers.
Every blue creature is playable, and this is even a knight, so it's certainly fine, but definitely it's not a card I'm like super juiced about playing or anything like that.
Do you want the Multiverse Legend first, or do you want a rare first?
Either one.
All right, we'll go with the Multiverse Legend since it's technically an uncommon. It is Raph Weatherlight Stalwart, the blue-white 1/3.
All right, I don't mind Raph. Raph is pretty good. I don't know that I would want to necessarily first pick Raph, but I think in this pack, this is actually what I'm taking right now.
I think so too. It's in one of the best color pairs, and it is quite strong. It's not a knight. He's a human wizard, but does really well going in, early game into late game. It kind of always has an application. Our rare is an Invasion of Gobakon, which saw some play at the PT. Yeah. That's the 1 and a white that taxes a card from their hand, and then it transforms into an enchantment that says at the beginning of your end step, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature that attacked this turn, and you can sacrifice this thing to give creatures you control hexproof and indestructible until end of turn, which actually comes up quite often as well.
Yeah, I think Invasion of Gobakon is good. I mean, it's a pretty strong card. If you cast it early, you often end up getting a lot of value out of it. But it's not a card that I'm not going to take it over Raph. I don't think I want to. start on an aggressive. Yeah, starting on an aggressive white deck, when you could take a blue-white card, which goes into only one archetype, but a little more flexibility is in terms of it can be a controlling card or it can be a more reactive card, I think is fine.
Yeah, that's where I would be too. I also just think that like, I mean, forcing stuff isn't really where you want to be, but like I will say if I could pick any archetype to just have like a B+ deck in from the beginning, it would probably be blue white. Like that archetype to me has been like the most consistent and the mix of the most consistent plus powerful when I've had a chance to have it. It's not even that hard to draft either. Like it's pretty, there's a lot of options for it. Okay. So there's our Crack-A-Pack. We both took RAF. Getting back to the PT, which we were talking about just a little bit ago, a little more zoomed in, we were talking about one game that you played. But big picture, how did your PT go before we get into the limited meeting overview?
Well, I did go 6-0 in limited, which I was happy about. Dude, that was pretty sweet.
Super nice. That's very, very difficult, by the way, for people listening. I mean, imagine, winning back-to-back drafts, right, at your local store, or, trophying twice in a row on Arena or something like that. Doesn't happen it's hard to do. You have to be on kind of a heater, but now you're playing against like literally the best players in the whole world. So that's super impressive. It's also like a major advantage records wise, right? I mean, you end up with 6 wins out of the limited portion, which is considered the part that's kind of a little less in your hands, right? It's a little more like, sometimes things just don't go well in the draft or whatever. And so, yeah, that's amazing, man. Nice work.
Yeah, I was super stoked about that. So I went like 3-0 in the draft. And I'll talk about the drafts after we do the limited meeting. I think that's probably a good way to sequence it. But a 3-0 in the first draft, 3-2 in the first constructed part. And I was thinking, okay, our deck's solid. We played Grixis Reanimator. 3-0 in the second draft, 9-2, feeling great. And then 1-4 in the second round of constructed, and not thrilled about that because that knocked off.
Tough.
Starting 9-2 and spewing it off, where like even just going 3-2 probably gets me a top 8, and going 2-3 gets me maybe a top 16.
Going 3-2 guarantees you a top 8. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was pretty bummed, to say the least.
What was your constructed deck?
It wasn't good.
It wasn't good. Okay.
We didn't win. We didn't win a lot. It was not good. It was not a good deck.
That's disappointing, man. You killed it in limited too.
Yeah. So really, really, really unhappy about that. But you can't. It is what it is. I wasn't able to. I picked a bad deck and kind of got punished as a result, and that is sometimes the thing that happens. So
okay.
I can hope for better next time. We just kind of missed on our constructed deck, unfortunately. At least the one. Really those of us who played Grixis. Some of us played Rakdos Breach, and that deck ended up being pretty good. So my team even had a good deck. I just picked the wrong one.
Okay. Well, what about limited though? You crushed limited personally, and you said Brent DeVos also went 6-0. So 2 people on your team like clean swept limited. That's insane.
Yeah, we're very, very happy about that. So the way our limited meeting ended up working was I ran the limited meeting, and beforehand we had already kind of planned that. Like the idea was that I was gonna be prepped and ready to do that, and we started by laying out the curve of, or like the value from like left to right, left being the best, of blue and white Knights cards with uncommons and commons both being represented. And
you actually lay these out on a table with physical cards, right?
Yeah, so I actually bought a set of March of the Machine. I bought everything but like the 10 most expensive cards because I thought that I could get 95% of the value for like 30% of the cost or whatever.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But I bought all the rares, all the commons, all the uncommons, all the multiverse legends and all that. And ended up, kind of laying all these out such that we are able to visualize and move them around. And I think that's a pretty important part of the whole thing. And so with like blue-white, for example, we're talking about all these cards in the context of blue-white, because I think just rating all the commons and uncommons is not as useful as really getting the breakdown of by archetype, because a card like Knight of the Coalition isn't really a card you want in black white, but it definitely is a card you want in blue white, and it's important to kind of know what you're trying to do with
that's
any
really
specific
good.
card.
Yeah, Order of the Mirror, the card we opened up in the Cracker pack. Like, that's a Knight. It's a 2-drop relevant Knight. Like, the Knights deck is all about it. But if you're in blue-green, okay, you can play it if you want, but it's not it's not like a priority or whatever, right? So that really matters, where if you were to lay out all of the commons top to bottom, where would Order of the Mirror fit? Well, it's like, who cares, right? Like, it gives you an idea for how powerful it is, but I don't know. You're playing with professional Magic players. They probably have an eye, enough to go, hey, that's pretty good, or that, that's a playable Magic card or whatever. But yeah, I definitely like doing it by archetype. You started with blue, white, and then you said you laid out all the commons and uncommons against each other, like in a ranked order, basically. Yeah,
and kind of in tiers. And it's also not that important. Like, the top cards are really important to kind of identify, Preening Champion just being the top of everything, every list that involved blue, basically. The other tiers aren't that important. Like, it's not really important what where the 7th best and 8th best common rank against each other. They're just in the same tier, and that's fine. And it kind of ended up discussing them, because like I laid them out with what I thought, but of course the other people on my team also voiced their opinions when we disagreed. There wasn't like tons of disagreement, but there was some. We did talk about it, and we kind of got to consensus there, talked about what mattered for the archetype, what you're trying to look at, and how you get into it. And like the way to, part of the reason that Preening Champion's so good, of course, is that if you're in blue, you're in the best color. So it's easy to get into any blue archetype when you start with Preening Champion. When you transition into Knights, it's like, well, do you see a late Knight? Like, is there a Knight of whatever, showing up in a later part of the pack? Did you get a 4th pick, Zalfiran Lancer? Is that what kind of signals are you looking for? And then once we had talked about that, we shifted to blue black. So I kind of like rearranged the cards, right? I took the same cards and ended up putting them in the same kind of order. Invasion of Amonkhet, Preening Champion being the top again, and talked about also like a different package, like the Omen Hawker, Corruption of Tawarashi, and a couple other in Eyes of Gitaxias. Like that sort of package is really important, and we were able to kind of discuss how that ended up working out. Like, what was the impetus for playing that, and like at what point do these become good?
So 2 or 3 card combinations, things that are within an archetype,
little pockets of synergy.
Out. Yeah.
Because if you have an Omen Hawker, or more often you go the other direction, you have a Corruption, and then you really heavily to prioritize Omen Hawker at that point. I see. Because you really want to be able to take advantage of turbo. I mean, when you go turn 5 Corruption, immediately incubate, like that's just incredible.
Yes.
Like you're super happy about that. We kept on talking through the archetypes. Didn't do all the archetypes. Did like blue, white, blue, black, blue, red, blue, green. Did all the blue ones. Then did black, red, sacrifice. Sam Party chimed in a lot there because he really likes that deck, and then he did in fact draft it at the PT. We went through all that. We also talked about black, white, and then white, green, and white, red. It didn't go so far as to lay them all out. Part of it is like I think they're pretty weak. And then part of it was we have to be cognizant of how much time we're spending. Like we don't have infinite time to do all this.
How much time did you spend on the meeting?
Probably like 4 hours, if I had to.
Wow.
If I had to guess.
This is legit. You guys are going into very much detail.
Yeah.
Is the vibe of the meeting like Luis is going to tell us how to do stuff, or is it like a open discussion with you kind of guiding the ship? What's the tone?
In between, like there were other people talking who had drafted and who had opinions. There were people who were chatting, who had questions, but I was running the meeting. And in a lot of cases, like people were deferring to kind of my opinions. I had just done, I think, the most drafts on our team.
Okay.
And at the end of it, we came to a pretty good consensus as to kind of what we thought. And some people were probably going to do things a little differently, but that's obviously fine. They can also do that,
Speaking of that, I've been in some of your guys' limited meetings that got actually pretty contentious. Like some
Yes.
certain types of personalities can kind of butt heads. Nothing mean. Well, actually, I did see one mean thing, but
certain,
yeah. But
some PT Gatecrash champions or what have you.
love to gnaw at the bone of an argument unendingly. But was that the tone with this particular group? Was there heated discussion, or was it pretty chill?
It was pretty chill. I think, honestly, I think a lot of it is that we're now older, a little bit calmer. Like people are just not that worked up about this stuff. Like,
because it can derail too, right? Like it's good to have a debate. It's good to have make somebody kind of defend their stance. If you go, I think that card's really good. It's like you should be able to answer why or in comparison to what. But it also can go too long where you're hashing it out over one card, and it's like there's a whole lot of more stuff to cover.
Yeah, but we were pretty on task. People were there to learn, and I think we did a pretty good job of that. After we broke down all the archetypes, we talked about some specific cards and combinations of cards, and that was also fine. And then we moved on to the rares. And so what we did with the rares is we took the top uncommon, which is Invasion of Amonkhet, the top common Preening Champion. Those are pretty close together. We kind of put them in the same vertical pile. And then we took another good common, which would be something like Deadly Derision or Final Flourish, right? And those were to the right with space in between. And then with the rares, we looked at where are the cards to the left, which were the best cards, which were better than the top common and uncommon. So we're talking cards like Sunfall, Elish Norn, both of them, Shieldred, the cards you would just take over everything.
Yep.
And then what are the cards that that you would take on par or close enough to Invasion of Amonkhet, Preening Champion, and what are the cards you take below them but above the solid commons, and then what are the rares that are either at or below the solid commons or just straight up unplayable.
Or just terrible. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what's the goal of that, right? Because, is it general information? Is it conceptually figuring out the thing? Or is this a pick? Is this pack one, pick one. This is how you're going to figure out what you're going to take.
It's both. It's part of it with the discussion of the rares, especially is the people who haven't played with a specific rare. It's really good to give them the opportunity to kind of hear other people's thoughts on that rare, because you're not going to have played with all the rares.
I see. So knowing that it's better than Preening Champion's one thing, but also you get to say why or how it plays out or whatever.
And it's good to know where all that ends up being, and then also knowing which of the rares are terrible or traps or something you really shouldn't be looking to try and play.
Where did the Multiverse Legends factor in? Because they're rare in the sense that they only get one slot per pack, but they're also kind of, there's uncommons. It's a little weird.
So where those factored in, they were supposed to be evaluated with the rares. The only reason they weren't was because they didn't get there on time. So I ended up in a spot where I had to we had to do those on the computer afterwards, but they would have been in the same category as the rares, just the normal rares. It just so happened that we weren't able to do that.
Okay. And what stood out about any of this stuff, the ranking, that kind of stuff?
There's a lot to talk about. There's tons of cards. That was definitely relevant. With the Multiverse Legends, especially, one of the things we did actually was go through every companion and how good is it? How do you companion it? All that stuff, basically trying to figure out how does this all work? And then trying to get to a place where basically everyone knew what was going on with all the cards.
I see.
I don't expect that people who have played will show up having played No Limited. You're kind of self-sabotaging if you do that. But we did want to make sure that everyone walking out of the meeting knew basically what the archetypes were, how they functioned, how good all the rares were. And maybe you don't remember every single thing, but the meeting combined with your experiences playing should probably get you pretty close to there, right? Or at least a decent start.
And there's a lot of room for discovery there where, like, even if you feel like you have a decent baseline on the set, having it all laid out in front of you can help you really conceptualize like what to prioritize and what's good, what's not. And I think that you touched on it, but really important too is to understand the pitfalls, right? Yeah. Like if you're like, hey man, red's wide open, it's like, well, there's a reason for that. You're the sucker here, right? You're the one who's taking all these cards, and or if you've only drafted a few times and haven't tried out like a certain archetype, like, whatever, green white, right? Green white struggles really badly because it rarely comes together in a powerful enough way to actually keep up with other stuff, but I'll tell you, if like when we did the set review and if you just read the cards, you could easily see green white just being a solid deck. Like there's a bunch of backup, there's payoffs, and you just think, oh yeah, this is fine. And for whatever reason, removal's too good, whatever, it doesn't work out. So you guys, hitting on those type of things seems to be like, that would be just as relevant to me if I was playing as the stuff that's good.
Yeah, and like a literal example from the last Pro Tour was when we talked about green white poison, and one of the guys on our team, Jakob, had not played with the poison cards at all. He hadn't played with green white specifically, and he ended up drafting it at the PT, partially because we talked about it, and he now kind of understood where that archetype ends up being.
Okay, yeah, that's really good. Any other stuff from the meeting? I mean, I am curious sort of about the big picture view on it. What are you hoping that people attending the meeting come away with or whatever?
The other thing is we did keep stats of in-house drafts, which weren't like a crazy amount of sample size, but it was enough to at least look at. I mean, they did a bunch of drafts. I wasn't there for those, but
did they do in person?
Yep, a bunch of in-person drafts.
Okay.
And basically where we ended up was, I mean, unsurprisingly, blue and black are just head and shoulders above everything else. And blue-black was a very desirable archetype. Blue-white was, and that was the only white archetype we really wanted to draft, blue-white knights. Weren't really that interested in red-white or green-white. Did like drafting the multicolor green decks to a degree, but those, that deck doesn't always come together.
Inconsistent, yeah.
And then basically the question is, how many blue and black drafters can a table support? And I think a table can support like 3 to 4, maybe I think 3 blue drafters, sometimes 4, 3 black drafters, sometimes 4. I think if there's 4, I think the people's decks will be a little worse. But you could draft blue-black when there's someone drafting blue-black 2 seats to your right and still end up with a good deck. Yeah, the cards were that good.
That's very deep color pair if that's the case, yeah.
Yeah. So really important to kind of figure out, like when we're talking that good, then yeah, we're in a spot where it is funny to try to figure out what we're doing and where we're at, and is it worth forcing? How much should you force it? Like one of the things that came up, because the flip cards, the way it worked at the PT was you'd open your pack, show everyone your flip card, then sleeve or flip cards, there's 2, and then sleeve your pack and then draft. But if someone, if I was sitting, you were to my right, and the person to your right opened a Shieldred and took it, I might be in a good position for black, because you're not going to take black because the person to your right first picked Shieldred. But knowing there's someone to my right not playing black might actually, and even if the person to the right was playing black, that wasn't enough to drive us off wanting to play it.
Wow, that's strong, because this is it's not every set that has double face cards on this level where you're actually getting that. You have to be playing live and in a set with double face cards to even have that become a possibility, and that did here. That was a big talking point for Paul and I when we were in the booth covering the drafts, as well as we got the information, from the floor about what the people were seeing to their right, specifically in pack 1, and how that might change the way that they drafted. And it did. I mean, for sure. It people were like, I'm not touching, this color if somebody opened up some big bomb or whatever to the side.
And yeah, at the end of it, I mean, this format has a lot of play to it. There's a lot of different ways you can go. There's a lot that really kind of changes how you end up drafting. And yeah, it is definitely a format that's fun to explore.
What about your drafts themselves?
So I started the first draft in blue, which was lucky, not by taking a great card, but by taking everyone's favorite Breeding Champion.
You don't think that's a great card?
Well, not a rare is the thing. There's so many good rares that it is definitely something that you want to you want to be able to put yourself in a position to play as many rares as possible.
Sure.
Ended up taking a black card immediately after that. So I took blue card, black card. I took Glistening Deluge, the -1/-1 to all creatures, -3/-3 to oil, green and white.
And what was in between?
It was Afara's Dispersal.
Okay.
So I had a good start.
Yeah.
I was happy with that. And then I took the -3/-3 or -1/-1 over a Zalfiran Lancer, the 3/3 for 3 that I think it's close, but I'd much rather be blue-black than blue-white. I just don't like going to Knight super early because it's a little narrower.
Uh-huh.
And then I fourth picked an Omenhawker over Knight of the New Coalition because I love Omenhawker in blue-black.
Okay.
Ended up taking a couple more blue cards, but then got a Swordsworn Cavalier, like 10th pick, the 3/1 first strike.
Yeah.
And then
the 2-drop.
Yeah, and then the Zalfiran Lancer came back.
Oh, okay.
And then I got Knight of the New Coalition back. So I'm like, okay, well, I'm just being like spoon-fed Knights. Easy. Yep. Pack 2, I got past a Chrome Siege Shark or a Chrome Shell Siege Shark. And it was okay. It wasn't the best in my deck, but it's still a great card. It's a 3-mana 2/4 flyer, such a high floor.
Yeah.
Ended up in blue-white Knights pretty solidly. That was my only rare, I think. My deck wasn't amazing, but it was fast. I got a late Tetsuko Umezawa to go with my 2 Swordsworn Cavaliers. Ended up just curving out on my opponents really nicely. Like
that's
it
gross.
Ended up working out really well.
Man, 2 Cavaliers with the Tetsuko. That's gross.
Yes, it was very good. And I had a game where I just played both and won easily. Played against my teammate Raph Levy in round 1. Ended up with this insane, like, kind of Magic the Puzzling situation where he had out a 3/3 Voldaren Thrillseeker. That's the 1/1 that can sack to do damage equal to its power. So it had 2 counters on it, so it's also a 3/3.
Uh-huh.
He played another Voldaren Thrillseeker, and he pumped, and he had a Scrappy Bruiser, the 3/4 raccoon that when it attacks gives a creature +2/+0 and trample. He played a second Voldaren Thrillseeker, putting both counters on his 3/3 vanilla, then attacked with everything, pumping the 3/3, which was now a 5/5. So he has a 5/5, he has a 7/5 trample that can sack to deal 7, a 3/3 that can sack to deal 3, and a 3/4, all attacking me, as well as a 1/1 back that can sack to deal 1. I ended up I had 2 tapped flyers and he was at 1. But I had 3 untapped 2/2. So I chump with all 3 because I have to, because then he's able to sack all of his creatures. And if he does, he can take me down to 1.
Oh, wow, that close.
Because he can fling for 7 +3/+1, and I took 5 trample down to 12.
Yeah.
Yeah. And ended up in a spot where I wasn't able to do anything. I had a forced play. But he couldn't take me to 1. Obviously, he would just lose if that was the case.
Because you just kill him with your flyers.
So he had to throw his whole board at my flyers, leaving the board as his 3/4, no cards in hand, nothing else in play. Me with nothing in play. Him at 1, me at 12, and I dropped Tetsuko Umezawa.
And he didn't come up with the answer, and you killed him the next turn.
Yeah. So
did he have anything to say?
No, he was definitely.
That's pretty good.
It was a fun one. So that I did enjoy that game. It was a tricky one. I wasn't able to really make him feel better because it was just that. You losing round 1, the PT sucks. But
yeah, for sure.
My other 2 matches weren't quite as close. I was able to just really have aggressive draws and kind of steamroll my opponents.
And then the second draft?
The second draft was a little tougher, actually. I started with blue and black cards, but I wasn't really getting anything that good. And I kind of wished I had taken Knights cards, and I never ended up really getting anything in the way of rares. But what I ended up doing was just drafting a really low curve Phyrexians deck, which is funny because I didn't ever draft that in testing exactly, but I had the grafted Butcher.
Yeah,
and
the Lord.
And I was able to just draft a really like double Ichor Drinker, grafted Butcher, tons of cheap cards, all that sort of deck. And I really liked how it played out.
I mean, you came by and talked to Paul and I about it, and you had the Butcher, but really not much else as far as like raw power went. But you said you just needed to get under everybody else, and then you kept walking by and giving us a thumbs up that you had won your match, and it was like, yeah, I guess you did get under everybody else. Is that how it played out?
Yeah, I mean, you saw the third match, but I played round one. Round one against my opponent's deck, who didn't really come together. They were like black green. They had really slow draws, and I just curved out. And I had a couple Convoke cards. I had a Preening Champion, that I got past in pack 2, and was able to just really, really kind of put them in a position where their cards didn't do much because they weren't able to play all their cards. They got to play 1 5-mana card, then I bounced it, and then I killed them. And that was kind of the game plan. And then round 2, I played against David Inglis, who actually played twice, and he beat me in Constructed at the last round of the tournament. But he was like black, white, blue, like white, black, splash blue with like Knights kind of mid-rangey. His deck also looked like it didn't really come together. It was kind of a weird draft table. And we had some really close games, but I had just like the perfect curve in game 3, like Omen Hawker into 2-drop, into Preening Champion, into like Temporal Cleansing. And it just like from there, it's really hard to come back. I have 4 creatures on the board and he has none. And then round 3 I played, you can actually watch it on the Twitch pod. It's played against Blue Red. If he had like 2 Convoke cards that he drew, I would have just lost those games because he had so many Rouse Reinforcements, but he just didn't have any Convoke cards, and it worked out pretty well for me.
Yeah, it actually gets really tough when you have, because it's okay to play a card like Rouse Reinforcements to fuel the Convoke deck, but if you don't have it, Rouse Reinforcements is subpar. It's a mediocre to weak card, and and he ended up playing 4 of them and having really no payoff. So that was a little bit tough. Well, nice job on the limited there, man. It sounds like you did a good job with the meeting, and then crushed some souls in the drafts too. So you kind of backed it up. So great job, man. Thanks. Good performance.
It was satisfying to do that. I wish I had played a better constructed deck, but I didn't, and I was happy with my prep for limited. So maybe try to balance that out a little bit more next time.
There you go. All right, let's touch on these 2 sets that we've been kind of hanging out in our rearview mirror, and we can finally send them away. The first one is Phyrexia All Will Be One. We really wanted to make sure that we came back and at least touched on the highs and lows for this set, gave it its final grade and that type of stuff. Mainly because it was somewhat controversial, and also just like neither of us liked it. And it's been kind of a long time since we had a set that we were both just like, no, like this didn't click. This isn't where I want to be. We're also going to talk about Shadows over Innistrad Remastered, but interestingly enough, that came out, part way through the Phyrexia All Will Be One draft run, and I jumped to it and I did not go back. I kind of found myself like after the PT or whatever, just looking for an excuse to not play it. Like I'd rather do that. I'd still rather draft than not, so it wasn't like that level, but at the same time it was like, man, this isn't really hitting. And we wanted to get into some of the reasons for that. I think the number one reason was, I think that a lot of things spread out from it, but I think it was the speed of the format. This was the fastest format that we've had on Arena of the, normal draft sets ever, like on Arena, since 17 Lands has been collecting data. Cause this is one place where we can have a lot of interesting discussions that we fold the 17 Lands data into as like a data point or a starting point or something like that. But we've also seen numerous examples where the numbers don't just tell you exactly what to do. See our conversation about context earlier for a given card. Right. This is a place, though, where it is just numbers, right? And what they do is they have an axis, an X graph, XY graph, where on one end is the average number of turns that a game takes. And then on the bottom is your game win rate on the play. And so these are related, right? And you can get an idea for how important is it to actually be on the play in a given format versus not. And also, how long are these games taking? And of the like non-cube sets or whatever, the Phyrexia All Will Be One is all the way down. I sorted it by Premier Draft and Traditional Draft just to get a little bit better of a snapshot. But if we just stick with Premier Draft, which is actually even less fast than Traditional Draft somehow, it's about 8.45 turns is the average number of turns that it took for the game to end. And you might think, well, that's actually quite a few turns. Like, that's a lot. But, if I were to pop up, some of the other sets that we've had, Kaldheim, for example, is effectively a full turn slower than that, which on average is a lot. Strixhaven is even slower than that. Same thing with like Neo. And if you want to get into the really slow stuff, you're talking about Dominaria, for example, is 9.8. RNA is 9.9. That's the slowest of the sort of normal draft sets. So, we're talking, and by the way, it's also worth noting that the gap from Premier Draft to the second place Premier Draft is quite big as well. You have to get up into like Mom or M21 or sets like that, that comparably speaking are in the 9 to 9.1 range. So we're talking about a solid half a turn. And that might not sound like a lot, but it is. And then simultaneous to that, it also has the highest of the normal sets with regards to game win rate on the play. So this means, how often do you win when you win the die roll? And this one's over 53%. And that is not, where they really want to be. I mean, they've tried to mitigate this as much, but 53% is a pretty big edge, right? Like if you just took that edge into the field, you'd actually end up being a decent winner over time, just by virtue of the fact that you won the die roll. So this to me so I want your thoughts on that, Luis, just the fact that the format's so quick, and then we'll talk about the sort of knock-on effects that happen as a result of that. Well, the format speed tells a lot of the story, not the full story, because you can have a format that's fast but still interactive, but it does tell a lot of the story. And in particular, this story was that a lot of the cool things in the format you don't really get a chance to do because of the format speed. You stumble a little, you end up in a spot where you feel like you don't get to play the game. I mean, it felt in Phyrexia that if you didn't have a 2-drop on the draw, you were almost always going to lose. It did feel that way. There were so many good 1-drops that when they got 1-drop, 2-drop on the play and you didn't play a spell till turn 3, you were just dead. Yeah, it really did feel like that. And I'm not saying that March of the Machines has none of that. Of course, like if they curve out and you don't do anything until turn 3, you can lose. But it was that effect was a lot stronger in Phyrexia All Is One. Yeah. There was also, I think, less interaction. The interactivity was lower than I would like in terms of like, are you able to stop them from doing what they do or interact with some of their best cards? There's a lot of good removal in March of the Machines, and I think that's a big part of why the bomminess of March of the Machines is definitely there, right? Like there's tons of rares and the bonus sheet and all that. There's like so many good cards. But because of all the interaction, you don't always lose to these rares in the same way that you would otherwise. Yeah, and the other effects happen on sort of two different axes here, right? Like when the format's so fast. One of them is that everybody's pushing towards the bottom of the curve. So you're trying to go for the 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop thing. And what that means is that anything that costs 5 or more, it has to pass real scrutiny to be able to be playable or to make it in your deck. And there's just a lot of cards that they print that cost 5 or more mana, and those get cut out. Those are way too slow, or you have to be very picky about which one or how many of those that you play. And so there's a chunk of cards that get kind of dismissed or, greatly marginalized right off the bat. And then on top of it, any archetype that requires time or setup or anything to kind of build up a little bit of pieces on the board, or, certain critical mass of a certain type of permanent, or allow something to breathe a little bit, gets squeezed out. A couple examples from the set, if you remember, were like Proliferate, right? They made a black-blue Proliferate deck that looked like it had some cool stuff going on, right? Maybe get a poison counter on your opponent, control the game, and then accrue proliferation over time to give you this kind of inevitability where you may not even need to really attack again. That has a real appeal to certain types of players. I like strategies like that. I think it makes it kind of an interesting change from the normal kind of build up enough creatures to attack, remove your stuff type scenario. But that was laughable. Like if you were sitting there fussing around with cards that were like, remember there was one in a blue, they get a poison counter, draw a card. It was like, get out of here with that. Like not even close to enough. Another one was the blue-red deck for oil counters, right? There was a lot of cards that were put into this set that augmented oil counters, that added them or gave you stuff to do with them. But it felt to me when I played cards that cared about oil counters, I only had the room to deal with the ones that cared about it on themselves, that wouldn't produce any more, and that it had to be good enough as a standalone card, in which case oil counters are sort of unnecessary complexity. Like you probably could have done this a lot simpler if you weren't trying to weave it into this broader archetype of oil counters. And that suffered. It was very rare that I would draft stuff that could play a card that literally just only cared about oil counters or augmenting creatures or permanents with oil counters. Because again, when the format gets that fast, you can't fuss around. You can't be sitting there trying to play these things and get cute.
Also with oil counters, especially, like they had this weird thing where red-green was the best color combination, right? It was the best archetype, all that. But it wasn't because red-green had this cool oil synergy. I remember Kuldotha Cackler, the 2/3 trample for 3 that gets +X/+O, or X the number when it attacks, or X the number of creatures with oil counters on them.
Yeah.
That card was not a card you played all that often. Like sometimes you would, but it did not live up to what it looked like, which was like, oh, this is probably one of the better commons in the red-green deck, right? It's going to be a 5/3 trample or whatever. The oil theme wasn't that good, and it's not why red-green was winning, certainly. Part of it was I expected oil and proliferate to be a cool combo where you can increase the number of counters on your creatures. Mostly it mattered whether you had one counter on a creature, because you had cards like Urabrask's Anointer that counted how many cards had one counter. Yeah. It didn't really matter how many counters you had. In fact, yes, there was the evolving adaptive that gets +1/+1 for each oil counter on it. Most of the cards, though, it's like you had an oil counter on it. Okay, it will do its thing. It doesn't matter if you have 1, 3, or 17. And there wasn't that many ways to use them. Sometimes you'd end up with a Rustvine Cultivator that just tapped and get a counter every turn. And it's like, cool, it's, turn 10, it's got 7 counters on it.
Yep.
What are you going to do? And it doesn't matter.
Yeah. And another, a way to encapsulate what you're saying here, Luis, like number 1 common, Chimney Rabble. That's for the red-green deck. The next one was Contagious Vorak.
That puts a 1/1 into play.
Yeah. Then there was Contagious Vorak, which didn't care about oil counters. Then there was Hexgold Slash, which didn't care about oil counters. And then there was Barb Batterfist. Those are the top 4 commons according to 17 lands. The next one that's in that deck was Furnace Strider, which does, but it just did the thing that it says on it, right? It was just use these 2 oil counters and off you go. But there was nothing even touching this that was in the broader context of that archetype.
Yeah, and it was kind of underexplored. It just kind of felt like the themes in Phyrexia All Is One just didn't work. Like, no, they didn't work. The cards that worked were the cards that were worked by themselves.
Yes.
And the format was fast. There wasn't a ton of interaction. Poison is also just a bad mechanic. I don't think poison, like, I get it. Mark Rosewater loves poison. It's like his life's goal to bring it back as many times as possible. And he gets to do that. But I think it's a bad mechanic. I think they should stop doing it.
What did you think about Corrupted as sort of a half measure?
So I think Corrupted is actually a bit better than most of the ways you could do poison. So I don't mind that in that sense. Like, oh, it's cool because it now a poison count other than exactly 10 matters, right? Once you get them to 3, that's a different threshold. Your cards turn on. But you know what? Just like every other mechanic in the set, it didn't really work. Like, yeah, sure. Sometimes you would you would be black white and you'd have some vivisection evangelists or whatever, the 3 white black 4/4 that when ETBs kills a creature if they're corrupted.
Mm-hmm.
But you just wouldn't really have an opportunity to make them work most of the time. And most of the corrupted cards, like, I mean, you draft the format plenty. How good are most of the corrupted cards?
Mediocre.
Like you would just assume they weren't going to work.
Yeah.
And poisoning people out didn't even work all that often. Like, yes,
No.
it did happen sometimes, but I guess it's not just like one thing that made Phyrexia, I think, be such a failure, at least when it comes to drafting. And we can say, oh, this is our opinion. We didn't like it. It was shared by many people. I think that if you took a vote of all the like people who draft on Arena, all the people who draft on Magic Online or in person, if you're able to get all of them to vote and look at the results, I think this would score very low, especially compared to sets from the last 3 years.
That's been the rumblings. People in chat, people on Twitter. It just doesn't seem to be a super well received set. Yeah. If you wanted to give it a grade, what would you give it? Is it a D?
D-, F+.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because I think that part of the lens that we use and most people that we interact with at this level use is the long-term lens, like how good is this by draft 30? And it wasn't good at all. Like it really failed.
It wasn't good by draft 4.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I still felt like exploring. I guess it's tough because I think any format would probably meet the requirement that I'm about to lay out, but I like the exploration phase, where people don't really know. It's not really like this ruthlessly efficient metagame yet, and you kind of get to try it out. The counter argument would be if you did that here, you just found out very quickly that nothing worked and that you just needed to do 1-drops and low stuff. Look,
Magic is a great game, the best game ever made. Like that's my opinion, right? Magic Draft is the best format ever made. Mm-hmm. So I have yet to meet a Magic set where the first couple of drafts don't have a lot of interest. Like I'm like, oh yeah, this is fun, new cards.
Yeah.
It didn't take very many drafts before Phyrexia was like, oh yeah, this sucks. I don't want to play this. And
yeah,
Magic has this huge advantage to start with because it is so cool. It's such a fun thing. But this really is just not. I just think that the combination of super fast, low interaction, all the stuff that we just talked about, just led to not that fun of an experience. And
yeah, it really did, especially relative to the last few years of sets. I think that the bar has definitely been raised. And if I were to compare this to those, we would be in the D or F range easily. Like this is the worst set that I've drafted in years.
Yeah. And part of it is, so just to be clear, we're not like bashing R&D because they put out a ton of great stuff. Part of it is in comparison to the fact that they have been just kicking ass over the last couple of years.
Yeah, it's that
March
simple.
of the Machine might be my favorite draft set of all time. Like,
woo, okay,
it's in my top 5 for sure. And the Call Time was fantastic. Dominaria United was fantastic.
Strixhaven, awesome. Yeah,
I love Strixhaven. Like, I don't know. It's hard. This is design is hard. Like it's hard to get these things right, and you won't always know until you're done, like whether you did, realistically, they don't have the opportunity or really incentive to like go in the lab and draft 50 times. You just can't do that. It's so hard to test draft. Draft is actually basically a lot of draft testing is actually testing sealed.
Oh yeah.
But at the end of it, did you build in good build, seeded the format with enough good build rounds? Is there good interaction? Are there fun things to be doing? Are there offbeat cards? And like March of the Machines has the companions, which add just a bunch of different decks to draft at the cost of a card or whatever. Yeah. Like there's a lot that you can do here, and I think that Phyrexia just didn't really get there, and that sometimes happens. That's okay.
Yeah, a couple of things I want to say to touch on what you just said, and of course, none of this is ever directed at any personal. Like the two things I want to say are, one, Luis and I both feel strongly that we have our allegiance is to you, the listener, right? We both do work for Wizards of the Coast. We both are entwined with them in some way, but we just are unwilling to pull punches when it comes to how we feel about this stuff, which is why we're dropping bombs on this set, right? And, we have to call it like we see it, or this show basically ceases to be useful to our audience, and that's our primary concern. That being said, yeah, this is not aimed at anybody or anything, because I can tell you right now that if one lens to view this through would be that Wizards of the Coast is producing content, right? They're a set is an experience that is designed for people. And as a content creator myself, and I know that Luis is the same way, I'll aim this at myself with regards to the watch channel, right? Because it's different than what we normally do here. It is extremely difficult to predict what will do well and what won't. I can put hours of extra effort into a video kind of thinking this one's going to be special, and it'll be like dead average. And I can do my normal, I try to set the bar very high for myself. So, normal, like put out a video I'm proud of type level, and it can just pop off. And it was some random watch off eBay that didn't have a brand name and I didn't think anybody would care about. And then boom, it just has, 1 million views or something crazy. And you're just like, oh, okay. And you can get better at predicting it, but on any individual piece of content, you do not get to predict how it's going to do. The bigger group, for me, I think that you would start to see that I actually have I do actually have a feel for what works, but on any one thing, you don't. And I'm sure, yet you try just as hard on every one. And I'm sure that's what happened here too. And it's always easy in retrospect to say, well, we missed a little bit here. We just pumped up these one drops a little bit too much, and then it just collapsed this format because it made everybody race to the bottom of the curve, and that cut out all the fun stuff, all the slow stuff, all the expensive stuff, all the cute stuff, all the build around stuff, just basically fell apart around that. And it's like, well, moving on, right? And you have to go to the next set. And that's what they did. And as you said, March of the Machine has been like a massive hit for us limited players. And, it's basically a hard lock to get an A, right? And, that's just how it goes.
My biggest question is, does it get an A+?
Yeah. That's, cause I've been enjoying it absolutely thoroughly too. Your A+. If it's, potentially your number one of all time, then of course it is. But, for me, I haven't lost any interest in it at all.
No, I did, someone asked me like, are you done with March of the Machine after Approach? I was like, no, I did 3 drafts yesterday.
Yeah. Right. Just because it's awesome.
The only thing competing now is Cube. Cube does get me a little bit, but one of the ways that I think that I've described doing design work before as is you're trying to solve a lot of tough puzzles and you don't really find out the answers. You don't find out whether you got it right or wrong until after the case is, and you can look back and try to learn from it, but it doesn't even necessarily mean you'll get it right the next time. It's hard. Totally.
I watched a short clip, an interview with Will Ferrell, the actor, and it was him talking about Elf, the Christmas movie that he did all those years ago. That's really popular, right? That movie's really kind of held up as a Christmas classic. It gets viewed. It's on all the cable channels around Christmas time and all that kind of stuff. And he had the same type of stuff that we just talked about. He said, I had no idea if this was even going to work, because he plays kind of a saccharine character where before his humor was a little edgier, let's say. And this, in this one, it was a lot like goofier, happier kind of thing. And he said, he thought, there was a decent chance that he was going to get absolutely thrashed for his performance in it because he hadn't really done that type of work. And it just was a risk. They were just out on a limb doing this goofy kind of Christmas movie. And it very easily could have fallen straight on its face, and he said they did some tests and they showed it to like families and stuff. And the families loved it. And they thought, okay, well, we kind of expected that. And then they showed it to a bunch of like college students, frat people or something like that, who were like a tougher audience or one that, and they loved it too. And they thought, oh, we might actually have something, but they didn't know. And they'd already made the movie, it's like the millions were spent, it was going to come out. And that's just kind of when you find out. Okay. So let's touch on one last thing before we go, which is Shadows over Innistrad Remastered. I just wanted to touch on the highs and lows of that. We don't need to do something super in depth, but I loved that set. It really worked. I jumped ship off of one and drafted that for the whole time until whatever else came out. And I actually had somewhat low expectations for it because reprint sets, sets that are made exclusively of non-new cards, they can feel a little what they are, which is like a little recycled or a little flat or a little like, I've kind of been here before, I've done this. Like, I'm not a huge fan of going back and drafting old sets that are kind of out. I much prefer to draft the newest stuff. And I thought it might have those vibes, but it didn't. They really took two different sets and mashed them together to make something that felt way different.
Yeah, I loved it. I thought it was great, and it was also illustrative of some of the stuff that we've talked about of what we would like to see for sets that rotate faster online.
Yes, right. And that was one of the things that I really wanted to point out, because I think the gameplay was really good. The archetypes came out, the pace was good, all of the sort of key metrics that we hoped there was interactivity, they hit a really nice middle ground with that. But the thing that really stood out was that they tried this rotating bonus sheet. If you remember, the set was set to be out for, I believe, 4 weeks in a row. And each week, the bonus sheet, that one slot, would be something different. And if you remember, the first one were tribal cards, and this was Innistrad as a plane as a tribal set. So there was a lot of payoffs for that. They put a bunch of lords in there. And sure enough, those decks did really well in that first week. But then they started rotating it through, and the next one was Flashback, and that completely changed how the set played, but didn't make you relearn the whole set and didn't go for the gimmicky alchemy stuff where it's like, oh, remember this card? Well, now it's cheaper, or now it does something different, which never has resonated. It's felt extraordinarily gimmicky to me. And I've hated it. I really thought I would like it when they announced that. We've talked about this on the show before, but as actually played out, I have never enjoyed any of the alchemy stuff when they change a card that already existed. I don't like it at all. And they managed to really make these sets feel different. I mean, from week to week, you could feel it. Not that it was a different set, but it just had a different vibe. You needed to know something else. And it really made me wonder two things. One, okay, this isn't wondering. I know this. I always want a bonus sheet going forward. Every set, I want a bonus sheet. And two, I wonder if maybe, once a week was kind of a lot. You could felt that they kind of shoehorned this set in between the end of one and in between the beginning of Mom or Cube or whatever it was. But like, it maybe not every week, but like switching that out mid-format, that felt right. That felt like it kept me interested, but I didn't have to relearn the whole thing. Yeah,
I think this is actually like the perfect way to do this, where you first of all, the Shadows over Innistrad or Innistrad Remastered wasn't, like you said, it wasn't new cards, so you would end up in a spot where they weren't designing and releasing a whole set of new cards. Like they were using previously designed cards. Huge R&D savings there. Second. Totally. The rotation was really well done. I actually have to give a shout out to JC Tao. He was the lead on that. And
he reached out and said he wanted our thoughts. Well, JC, here's our thoughts.
Yeah, we got to give him a standing ovation here. I think it was excellent. I think that the rotations they weren't all equally fun / powerful or whatever. Like, there's going to be some variance there, but in general, I think they did a good job of emphasizing different aspects of the draft environment and de-emphasizing others on a week-by-week basis, while the baseline stayed the same, which means that it's also the barrier to entry to getting in is not massive. Once, like if you played in week 1, you could come back in week 3, and it's not like you had to relearn everything. It's just you could look at the 12 or whatever cards, 15 cards, I don't remember how many it was that were rotated that week, and be like, oh, all the tribal lords rotated out and a bunch of cards with flashback rotated in. Okay, I see what's happening. Or a bunch of morbid cards rotated in. The morbid week didn't really work, but that's because morbid as a mechanic doesn't work.
Yeah,
like it's never worked.
Right.
That's not something you can do. You can't solve that now. But my one change I would like to see if they were going to do this again, and I hope they did. I drafted enough single-handedly that should bring it back already. Is I think once a week is too fast, even for entrenched arena players. I think I would have liked to see if they had a month to run this, just 2 changes, and they each lasted 2 weeks. If you had 6 weeks, maybe 3 changes, just because I think that 1 change a week was pushing it. But yeah, overall, it worked out really well. I thought it was just really cool.
I did too. I would love to see this become the template, for reprint sets going forward. Take 2 sets, combine them in a reasonable way, and then use the bonus sheet to mix it up and also keep the set fresh. I would also not hate to just see the bonus sheet rotate on the main set too. I don't know how that works with paper cards. Maybe that's not something that you can do in paper, and fair enough if not. But the bonus sheets have been sort of a revelation, I think, for Limited. You've seen that they've gone more and more towards it. I actually had a chance to speak with a relatively high-ranking official from Wizards of the Coast, and when I was asked for feedback about some of the latest sets, I hammered that point home, and I could tell that point had already been I wasn't the first one to say that. Yeah, it was not a controversial stance that I said I absolutely love bonus sheets and would love to see them on every set. So this is definitely, my impression was that this is being talked about, and you can just see it. I mean, the last sets have had them, and I think that they should just become part of the thing. They're also just such a great way to use old cards, to introduce old cards for other formats, to get cool reprints for people that never had a chance to get these cards, and also just to reuse relevant designs, right? I mean, there's some just classically awesome cards that you just can't really reprint and just aren't ever going to see limited play again outside of weird stuff. And you can just throw them on the bonus sheet, and all of a sudden, a whole new crop of players gets to experience some of the better build-arounds or interesting stuff that's existed for Magic's history that, wouldn't really find a home now.
Yeah, I think that there is some difficulty design-wise with them. It's not trivial, but of course that's the job. So, I think they've found this is a good way to leverage old cards to create more fun. And I think we kind of know they're going to keep doing it because it's been well received. I think that one of the things that it's probably on their radar is bonus sheets like the one in March of the Machine did have a little bit of an effect of overshadowing the March cards somewhat, where a lot of the best cards in the format were on the bonus sheet. Yorion, the Elish Norn Grand Cenobite, the 7-mana one, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I think that they're probably going to kind of look at that going forward to try to how to craft a bonus sheet that maybe enhances the draft experience more so than like dominating it. And I don't think the March bonus sheet was like crazy bad in that regard, but I think if I were someone on leading that set or working on that set and I got a chance to like, hey, you can dial this back now, even though the set's already out, I would choose yes. I think it's probably cranked a little bit further in that direction than is optimal, but that doesn't mean that it was a bad thing to do. I think it still was a great thing to do in this case.
So what grade would you give Shadows over Innistrad Remastered? I'd give it an A. I just thought it was awesome.
I'll just give it an A.
It was super great. Yeah.
I think that it gets everything, it hits all the notes. I think it is really fun for the people who drafted these sets before because they get to revisit them, and they are slightly different context, and things are a little like Laboratory Brute was never as good as it was here, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And for people who haven't drafted it, it's a good experience of like, hey, this is what these were like. It's a little bit more on the complicated side, but the reprint sets the remastered sets are always a little bit more of a nod to the people who are into that experience. But even people who had never drafted it, I think they did. This was all another really good decision. They started week 1 with all the tribal lords in, and those were some of the better decks. And that's a good entry point to the format.
And those are easy handholds too, right? If you haven't drafted Shadows over Innistrad or Eldritch Moon before, you can read one of the, uncommon lords and go, okay, I get it, right? I need to draft vampires. I need to draft werewolves and get you into the format. And then you'll find the more, hopefully you'll find the clues deck, and really, really go deep down the line. Okay, let's call it a show there, Luis. Next week, we are lining up a guest. It's looking like we're going to be able to have Ryan Spain on, original co-host of Limited Resources, who now works on Magic Online. And he recently released the changes that he made to the Vintage Cube, which is back up on Magic Online, by the way. I know you've been playing it, Luis. I have too. And there's a bunch of changes there. You can tell a lot of thought went into them, a lot of like philosophical type stuff. And I know that you've said the ones you liked were indifferent and didn't like on your stream. But I figured if we can have Ryan to come on to talk about it, that would be really fun, from a big picture perspective, and just to check in with Ryan, see how things are going. So it's looking like that's going to happen for next week. So once I 100% confirm it, I'll put up a thing on the Patreon as well for people to ask questions, so that if you have questions for Ryan, old school LR, really old school LR listeners can chime in. And then, of course, just about Magic Online or the Vintage Cube in general, since they're kind of running the ship over there now. So that's really exciting. We'll look forward to that. Also, Luis, I did have to tell you one quick story from the PT. I had a really nice listener named Liam came up and said, "Hey, it's really nice to meet you. I've been listening to your show since I was a kid. I love it. I just wanted to say hi." And I'm like, "Oh, that's awesome. Really nice guy." And I said, "Who was a co-host when you started?" And he said, "Oh, Luis." And this person was an adult now, like he was young, but like, all right. I'm like, okay, it's official. Like you're no longer the new co-host.
I'm always going to be, for people who are listening when I started, I'll always be the new co-host.
It's true.
And even I think for us, that started to fade a little bit. I've now kind of started to internalize the fact that I've been the co-host for almost a decade at this point.
Yeah, but I think that Liam may have just stamped out any idea of that. But anyway, I had to share that. I
had a similar experience, not at this Pro Tour, but the last one. This man comes over and is like, "Hey, I just wanted to say hi. I was a little kid when I started to play Magic at the CFP Game Center, and back when you were PTQing, and I won my first PTQ. I came to the Pro Tour, and like it's been awesome." And I was like, "Oh, cool." He's like, "Yeah, I was like 11, and now I'm 30, and like I'm like, oh God."
Yeah, it's like you're smiling and nodding, and like your whole life is passing in front of your eyes. But I mean, it's obviously amazing, that we've had the show around long enough to have such a deep community like that, where people have literally just grown up listening to the show. I, of course, never thought that would be the case when Ryan and I started all those years ago. So thanks, Liam, for stopping by to say hi. That was really nice. And we got our value telling Luis's story. So yeah, that's going to do it for this episode. If you want to find us on social media, Marshall_LR and Luis's LSV. You can find everything related to the podcast at lrcast.com, including a link to our Patreon. Again, if you want to support us, it's kind of the thing we have going right now, and it's patreon.com/limited resources. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.
All right. Well, since you told the story, I decided, you know what? I wasn't going to do it, but I'm going to tell a story from the Pro Tour that you were there for this, Marshall, so you might remember it. Me and you were talking to Olivia Gilbert-Hicks of Commander at Home and cosplay fame, on the Commander Rules Committee and all that, or maybe the community. I don't know. She's on at least one of the Commander committees. I don't remember which one. I know there's multiple. And this guy's looking at us, and he had that look, of like, okay, I think I know who these people are, but like, let me check. Okay, yeah. He comes over and he's like, "Oh man, Olivia, I'm a huge fan. Can you sign my playmat?" And she's like, "Yeah, sure, of course." And then he looks at me, he's like, "You're LSV, right?" I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, "Can you sign my playmat? I'm a huge fan." I'm like, "Yep, totally." And then he looks at you, and see, the thing is, I've been involved in this kind of thing plenty of times because Magic pros or cosplayers or podcasters, Commander folk, we all kind of hang out together and talk at events. So if someone who's a fan comes up, they might know who some or all of the people are, but maybe some they're not 100% sure of. And it's always kind of awkward. Like I've had the experience. I actually had this I was talking to Nassif and one of our other teammates. It was Brent, actually, I think. And this guy comes up, he's like, "Hey, LSV." I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, "Hey, would you mind taking a picture of me with Nassif?"
Yeah.
And I was like, "Yeah, sure." And then I was totally fine to do that. And then
yeah.
And then he switched. He also wanted to do the other way around. But it is funny when that happens. So anyway, this guy gets Olivia to sign it, gets me to sign it. And then he looks at you and he's like, "Ben Wheeler?" With like his eye cocked.
He totally did. And I just started laughing because I love Ben Wheeler. He does work with Loading Ready Run, and he's just like absolute character. But him and I are very different personalities. And I said, "No," I said, "Marshall." And then he's like, "Oh, Marshall Sutcliffe." I'm like, yeah, that's me. And he's like, "Sorry, I got confused." But I mean, I've been called LSV. I've been called BDM. Like I think I've gotten all of it over the years.